I decided to camp alone in the woods because I wanted some peace and quiet, a break from the city's noise and the endless scrolling on my phone. The idea of spending a weekend under the stars, surrounded by nothing but nature, sounded perfect. So, I packed my gear, drove out to the trailhead, and hiked deep into the forest until I found the perfect spot. The clearing was small, just enough space for my tent and a little fire. The trees were tall and thick, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft, greenish hue. It was beautiful and serene, exactly what I was looking for. I set up camp, got a fire going, and settled in for the evening. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, and the occasional hoot of an owl. I was at peace, staring into the crackling fire, letting my mind wander. That's when I first heard it, a faint, almost melodic whistling. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it had a rhythm to it, a tune. I stopped and listened carefully, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The whistling was distant but clear, and it seemed to be getting closer. I tried to convince myself it was just another camper, maybe someone who had set up nearby. But the more I listened, the more uneasy I became. The tune was strange, not like any song I'd ever heard, and it was being whistled in a slow, deliberate way that made my skin crawl. I stood up, straining to see through the dark trees, but there was nothing, just shadows. The whistling stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was nothing, just the woods playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something odd. On the tree closest to my tent, there were carvings, rough, deep marks that I hadn't seen before. They looked like symbols or letters, though I couldn't make them out in the dim light. I knelt down to get a closer look, running my fingers over the grooves. The wood felt cold, unnaturally so. A chill ran down my spine. These carvings hadn't been there when I set up camp. Someone had made them while I was sitting by the fire. The whistling started again, this time much closer, and my heart began to race. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around the clearing, but all I saw were trees and shadows. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that I was overreacting. But the unease in my gut told me something wasn't right. I quickly doused the fire and retreated into my tent, zipping it up tight. I lay there in the dark, listening intently. The whistling was closer now, just beyond the clearing, moving slowly around my campsite. I held my breath, straining to hear if there were footsteps or any other sound. But there was only that haunting whistle. It circled my tent, and I could see faint shadows moving outside, just out of reach of my flashlight. My mind raced with thoughts of who, or what, could be out there. I didn't dare move or make a sound, hoping that whatever it was would lose interest and go away. Minutes felt like hours as the whistling continued, a maddeningly slow tune that grated on my nerves. I could feel my sanity slipping, fear clawing at my chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whistling stopped. Silence. The kind that presses in on you, making your heart pound louder in your ears. I didn't know if that was better or worse. My body was tense, every muscle coiled like a spring, ready to bolt at the slightest noise. Then I heard it, a faint scratching on the fabric of my tent, just inches from my head. My breath caught in my throat, and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that I was imagining it. But the sound persisted, slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, was dragging a sharp object across the material. I fumbled for my knife, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but holding it gave me a shred of comfort. The scratching continued, moving around the tent, followed by a low, guttural whisper that I couldn't make out. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, scanning the area with my flashlight. The shadows were deeper now, but I didn't see anyone or anything. Taking a deep breath, I gathered my courage and bolted from the tent, knife in hand. The moment I stepped out, the whistling started again, this time so close it felt like it was right next to my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the dark, endless forest. Panic surged through me, and I started running, not caring which direction I went as long as it was away from the whistling. My flashlight's beam bounced wildly as I sprinted through the trees, branches slashing at my arms and face. The whistling followed, relentless, echoing in the dark like a predator's call. I didn't stop until I was gasping for breath, my legs burning from the exertion. I leaned against a tree, trying to gather my bearings. The whistling had stopped, and for a moment, I thought I might have escaped. But then I noticed the carvings, those same strange symbols, etched into the tree I was leaning against. They were fresh, the wood still raw and exposed. My blood ran cold. I turned around slowly, dread settling in the pit of my stomach. In the distance, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, I saw them. Shadowy figures standing between the trees, their shapes barely distinguishable from the darkness. There were at least 3 of them, motionless, watching me. Fear gripped me so tightly I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figures didn't move, just stood there, as if waiting for something. And then, as if on cue, the whistling started again, coming from all around me, as if the entire forest was singing that dreadful tune. The figures began to move, slowly, deliberately, closing in on me. I snapped out of my paralysis and took off running again, this time with no regard for the direction. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between me and those things as possible. The whistling grew louder, almost deafening, as if the trees themselves were alive with it. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept running, driven by pure terror. I didn't know how long I ran, but eventually, I burst out of the woods and onto a dirt road. The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. I collapsed onto the road, too exhausted to move, my body trembling with fear. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. I just lay there, staring up at the sky, waiting for the sun to rise. When dawn finally broke, I found the strength to stand and began walking, determined to put as much distance between me and that cursed forest as possible. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I collapsed in front of a gas station, unable to explain to anyone what had happened. Even now, I can still hear that whistling in my dreams, a haunting melody that chills me to the bone. I don't know what those figures were or what they wanted, but I do know one thing. I'll never go camping alone in the woods again.